Good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Park, and the Director of Asian American Studies at the University of Maryland, where we're celebrating, again, our 20th anniversary. I would also like to acknowledge with gratitude our co-sponsors, Micah, as well as the new student organization, South Asian Student Association, SASA, as well as AASU, the Asian American Student Union. Thank you for your co-sponsorship and your work with us. We all would like to welcome you to today's webinar, the South Asian American Experience in the DMV region. We are fortunate to have our three panelists tonight for their amazing work and expertise in this area. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, we ask that if you have any questions for the panelists, please submit them under the Q&A feature. You'll see that at the bottom center. And that we will have two students who will be moderating the Q&A session, and they will field your questions and ask the panelists depending on, I guess, subject matter. And secondly, I think before you came on, there was a question about consent for the session to be recorded. So be mindful of that. So without further ado, I will introduce each of the panelists before they speak. So our first speaker will be Jyothi Mohan. And by the way, Jyothi will be teaching a 200 level class in the spring on South Asian American experience. So just wanted to give a plug for her course that will be taught, I believe, on Wednesday evenings. Correct, Jyothi? Yes, okay. So Jyothi is a historian who works on South Asian and South Asian American issues. She has taught on South Asian American history and culture widely in the NCT area. Okay. And remains actively connected with South Asian organizations which seek to promote South Asian participation in public life. She is the author of Claiming India, French Scholars and the Preoccupation with India in the 19th Century. Jyothi?
Hi, hello everybody. It's really great to be here. And I am really looking forward to talking with you a little bit about the background of South Asians in the larger DMV or Maryland, Virginia region. As an historian, I sort of kind of tend to dig in the background. So what I'm going to do is I am going to hopefully share my PowerPoint with you. All right, so South Asian Americans in the DMV region. There are, as I see it, for most immigrant groups in the United States, several different paths by which they stake a claim to belonging in the nation, right? One of the earliest and one of the most common ways of belonging is to claim antiquity. So for example, a lot of immigrant groups in the United States claim that they came over very early and therefore that they have a right to be at the decision table because they were early to these shores. You'll find this commonly among people, you know, who say, oh, we came over with the Mayflower or we came over with the Pilgrims and stuff like that. What's interesting is South Asians actually have roots as far back as the Jamestown colony, which is something I'm going to talk about. The other way in which a group can claim to belong to a new country is through assimilation. Now, I use this word very uncomfortably because assimilation has tended to mean different things in different periods of time. Until very recently, assimilation tended to mean that a minority group had to subordinate its identity to a majority group. Fortunately, it has now become a little bit more widespread or more inclusive in that it tends to mean more of a plural or a diverse sort of practice where society co-opts and coexists with different beliefs, lifestyles, cultural forms, and so on. In terms of the South Asian community, we have seen both of these patterns of behavior take place where South Asians have assimilated to the extent that they have vanished into other larger groups of people, particularly African Americans. We've also seen in the more modern era the formation of a very specifically distinct South Asian identity, which is what you will probably recognize if you look around you right now and see people who are of South Asian descent wearing distinctive clothes, celebrating their own festivals, going to particular places of worship and things like that. The third way in which you can belong is by claiming some kind of contribution to the new nation state. Contributions in terms of, socially or economically. And in these ways also, as we can see, just by the virtue of the fact that South Asians have been around in the United States or in America for almost as long as the English have been around in America, as well as the economic and social cultural contributions of South Asians, all of these paths of belongings can be claimed by South Asians. So this is what I want to focus on in today's talks. In the colonial era, and when I say colonial era, I'm focusing, like I said, on the colonial Chesapeake region. This is prior to the formation of an actual DMV, a geographical sort of identity. So we're looking generally in the Virginia, Maryland region. And what we see is that as early as 1624, there is a reference to Tony, an East Indian, who was part of the headright of a man called George Menifee, who was actually a landed man and became quite powerful in the Jamestown settlement. His family was quite wealthy and landed. And this means that we have reference to East Indians landing in Jamestown and becoming part of the fabric of that colony as early as within a generation of the English arriving in Jamestown. Similarly, we find that in Maryland, in the records, Maryland General Assembly records, we have inventories of people. So in 1676, we have an East India servant boy who was part of somebody's property and valued at 2,500 pounds of tobacco. In 1718, in Anne Arundel County, 2 East India Indians worth 30 pounds each were part of Samuel Shoe's property. And in Lancaster County of Virginia, we have a man called Richard Weaver, who seems to have been born about 1675. He was of East Indian origin, and he, along with his 2 brothers, are noted to be in Lancaster County, Virginia around this time. The Weavers would later go on to form an extended free settlement of free Blacks in the Carolinas that consisted of over 150 people of color. Then you have in 1698, a man called Michael Miller of Kent County, Maryland, who purchased the remaining 5 years of indentured servitude left on an unnamed East Indian boy. So you can see that these are very, very early references to indentured servants who are coming over. Most of the East Indians came over as indentured servants, and they completed their indentures in Maryland counties. For example, we have references to many of them completing their indenture period of time, which means that they would have claimed headright and settled down as free workers after this. John Williams in 1706, Thomas Mayhew in Prince George's County in 1728, and William Creek in Anne Arundel County in 1736. I've specifically chosen these counties because you can see that these counties are really kind of in the suburbs of DC. So what we now think of as the DMV region. The other thing that we find is slavery and servitude in the colonial Chesapeake. Many East Indians who arrived in America, they came with westernized names because they'd already been converted to Christianity by their British masters. In fact, after 1710 or so, the number of East Indians in colonial records outnumber the Indian slaves in the Chesapeake. And by Indian, we're talking about Native Americans. So by this time, we have fewer Native Americans who were enslaved or in servitude than we had East Indians in the Chesapeake. The earliest reference to a person of East Indian heritage being born in America is the case of a woman called Mary Fisher. Mary Fisher was born in about 1680 to Peter Fisher, who was an East Indian servant who worked for Lord Baltimore in St. Mary's County, Maryland, and an legitimate encounter with Mary Malloyd, an Irish indentured servant. So she is the first person who is of Indian origin being born on American soil. By this period of time, the Chesapeake was enacting laws. We're coming now towards the last quarter of the 17th century. So now we get a system whereby the period of time where the social division was between those who were free and those who were indentured servants. And so it really didn't matter what race or what skin color they belonged to. All indentured servants were in a category of their own, and all free people were in a category of their own. Now, this period is rapidly coming to an end and being replaced by a system of racialized slavery, where you get Africans and people of color who are being targeted to be people who are subordinate to the whites. By the 1680s, laws were in place determining that the mother would determine the status of any colored child, okay? By that logic, Mary Fisher was born to Mary Malloyd, an Irish indentured servant, should have been free. But we know that her descendants, 2 generations down, were enslaved Black people. So we know that it is hard to separate them. The records also make it really hard to understand a very distinct South Asian presence, because words like colored, East India, Indian, Negro, mulatto, these are all used interchangeably. Malaga Mall, yellow Indian, all of these words make their appearance in the records. So it's not like people were being very specific about the kind of vocabulary or language they used. And so it's kind of hard to tease out which ones were really of South Asian origin and which ones were sort of lighter skinned African Americans. More or less what we find is that the South Asians, or those who were of South Asian origin, increasingly tended to marry within communities of color, which would eventually be the African Americans. And so they tend to see themselves sinking into slavery. As African slavery rapidly replaced the system of indenture in the Chesapeake region, most of them marry into Black communities and disappear from the historical record. The fact that they are enslaved by this period of time is interesting, because by the early 18th century, by 1730 onwards, we are getting some runaway slave advertisements looking for East Indian slaves, which is different from a servant. So we see the change in their legal status taking place. In the Revolutionary era, by the time of the Revolution, there was a sizable contingent of East Indians in the Chesapeake region. While these slaves and servants disappeared into groups of Africans, another source of East Indians were sailors, also called Lascars, in the Indian Ocean area. Now, it's important to remember that these Lascars actually played a huge role in the enrichment of the Eastern seaboard. In fact, most of the Eastern seaports, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, all of these places saw a huge influx of wealth come in because of the East Indian trade. And the crews on board these ships, these merchant ships that were carrying cargo in between India and the Indian Ocean region, as well as the eastern seaboard, were mostly crews of Lascars. Lascars came from different islands in the Indian Ocean, as well as from the mainland of India. And most of the time when they came over to North America, they tended to have a contract whereby they would travel on the ship, and then they would be put up by the merchant who had chartered the ship until that merchant could raise the funds or raise the cargo to send back a convoy of ships to the Indian Ocean, upon which time the Lascar crew would then return back to the Indian Ocean. So for some Lascars, this meant that they would spend weeks, sometimes even months, in these ports. And their sort of legal status was very ambiguous when they were in these ports. In fact, there is an interesting case of a Lascar whose name is, he's written in the records, is written up in the records as a man called Sikh Kesar. He seems to have landed in Baltimore in about 1780, 85. And then he was stuck in the port of Baltimore for entirely longer than he was willing. He was very homesick and decided to make his way up to Philadelphia to see if he could find a journey back from Philadelphia to the Indian Ocean. When in Philadelphia, he was unable to successfully find a voyage back, and he became a public charge upon the city. So that's why we have records. We have a petition written by Sikh Kesar, and it's actually been read by Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia in 1785, complaining that the merchant who had promised to send him back to the Indian Ocean has disappeared, and that he is now stranded in this city where he is unable to make ends meet. So for almost 10 months, the city of Philadelphia had to feed and clothe him. And so he was a public charge on them. The other part of the petition that Sikh Kesar wrote was that when he was in Baltimore, he was hoodwinked by a white man who apparently kidnapped his son into slavery, and that he was unable to locate the boy. The whole sordid incident sort of, it became also a sort of a battle between Maryland and Pennsylvania, where Pennsylvania was resentful that they were taking charge of a case that essentially Maryland should pay for. The whole thing ended with Sikh Kesar being extradited back to Maryland and sent back from Baltimore to the Indian Ocean, and we don't hear from him again. But there is no evidence that he ever was able to recover his son. So as you can see, that is a case of an East Indian boy who would have been disappeared into the slave network. We have no idea where he would have gone and what he would have done. The case of Sikh Kesar exposes the ambiguous position of East Indians while being people of color. They're legally free. They're not slaves, right? They're legally free. So he could claim to be a public charge in Philadelphia, and the city had to support him rather than order him to work off, sort of pay his way or work his way through. But at the same time, the fact that his son could so easily be kidnapped into slavery shows the ambiguous position that we're now finding is occurring in these colonies vis-a-vis people of color. Okay. So now we move into the 19th century, all right? So we're gonna just sort of wrap up real quick. Lascars continued to make their way to America during the 19th century. Very few of them actually stayed behind or jumped ship. So we have a lot of coming and going. We have a lot of interaction in the eastern seaboard cities, but we don't have a lot of settlement. You might have had one or two who settled down to open a boarding house here and there, but most of them tended to then marry with free communities of color and sort of disappear from the record. There is also the record of about at least 50 people of East Indian origin who fought in the Civil War. And it's interesting how all these people made their way to be Civil War soldiers. Some were British Army soldiers, some were indentured servants, and yet others actually were coming from the British Caribbean now, because the Indian coolie labor was being taken over to British Guyana and all these other places. By the middle of the 19th century, we also get the fact that India is now a colony of the British Crown. And so you have a handful of Indian students who came from well-to-do families who arrive in the universities of the United States for an education. As they trickled in, you start seeing the establishment of a chair in Sanskrit in Harvard and all these places. And so these students traveled around when they could during their vacations to see as much of the country as they could. And so people in the DMV area, for lack of a better term, would probably have been able to meet with and speak to a turbaned, Hindu student. The other population over there would have been sort of godmen, the influx of swamis and people of, coming for religious tours. The most famous, of course, being Swami Vivekananda, who came to attend the Parliament of Religions that was part of the Chicago World Fair of 1893, following which he spent a year touring all over the US and giving lectures. So the top picture that's up there is of Vivekananda. Then there is this image of Pandita Ramabai, who was a child widow in India and who came to the United States to get a degree in medicine so that she could go back and look after the medical needs of women in India. And a lot of American women actually flocked to her cause. You have in the early 20th century, one among many different godmen who came along. You get the, representations of the occasional diplomatic envoys coming. And then the last one, of course, is a representation of the India Tea Pavilion at the St. Louis World Fair, which is a separate project that I'm doing, which looks at the representation of India in the world fairs of Chicago and St. Louis and Philadelphia and stuff like that, which is very cool and exciting. And it's interesting to see what happens to the natives that come over there. Suffice it to say, for the purposes of today's talk, very few of them actually make their way to the DC region. And those who do kind of disappear again and again, like I say, the rare few disappear into the free Black population. This gentleman up here, right up in front, had come for the St. Louis Exposition of 1904, and he was part of the exhibit called Mysterious Asia. All right, so now we move down to the 20th century. So the immigrations of East Indians to America during the first half of the 20th century occurred primarily along the West Coast, California and Washington. These areas had farming and logging communities where South Asians flourished. As a result, the DMV population remains a fairly itinerant population. By the middle of the century, however, there are a couple of interesting things that happen. One is that historian Vivek Bald has traced a group of Bangladeshi businessmen, some of whom who were Lascars, who then jumped ship and settled down in Baltimore. And they opened up businesses in Baltimore, and they married into free Black and Puerto Rican families. So that image right up there on the top right-hand corner is a mid-century photograph of many of these extended Bangladeshi American families. At the same time, you get an increased interest in India and vice versa, an interest in America by Indians, people who were interested in the civil rights movement in the United States traveled to India to learn a lot about the freedom movement in India. And so members of the freedom movement in India also came to the United States. We have references of fairly prominent Indians traveling all over the US and speaking in support of the civil rights movement, in support of desegregation, championing the causes of non-cooperation, non-violence. There was even a gentleman who later became a parliamentarian in India, a man called Mudgal, who was a publisher of a Black newspaper in New York, which promoted the civil rights movement. So you see a lot of activity between the South Asian community and the civil rights movement, but no real permanent community that is yet taken place in the Washington, D.C. area. In the 60s, we get the election of Dalip Singh Sound, who was a senator from California. So that is probably the closest. Dalip Singh Sound's few months every year in Congress was probably the closest that you would get to the population of South Asians here. In 1965, the Immigration Naturalization Act was passed by President Lyndon Johnson, which changed things up hugely. Previously, there were quotas on different countries, and there were certain countries that were preferred to other countries. These quotas were now changed around, removed. There were multiple things that the act did. And as a result, the US now opened up its doors to qualified people. Remember, this is post-World War II, where there was a huge need for professionals. In India, this was a period of independence from the British. And so it was a period where Indians were thronging to technical degrees like medicine, engineering, and science, becoming scientists. So these people who are freshly qualified as doctors, engineers, scientists from India now make their way to the United States after 1965. Thousands and thousands of them came over, and they settled primarily where they got jobs, which meant that there were quite a few who settled in the DMV region simply because there are a number of hospitals and think tanks over here. But we still do not see the creation of a numerically large enough community to call it a unified sort of South Asian community. By the 1990s, there is a huge shift that takes place. India opens up its economy, and as a result of that, the immigration laws from the Indian side are loosened even further. There's a huge outpouring exodus of professionals in the information technology area, IT, and they are coming in literally by the hundreds of thousands, a development that has not yet stopped even today. And at the same time, you see that in the Clinton economy, this is around the sort of the end of the Clinton economy, you see Silicon Valley is looking for high profile but relatively low rent areas to proliferate. And that's when you get the tech corridor being opened up in the Northern Virginia suburbs, Fairfax County, and the suburbs of Maryland. And so now you get hundreds of thousands of people of South Asian origin coming to work in these tech companies. Now is when you see a numerically large population of South Asians. By the 2000s, most of these IT professionals had gotten citizenship, which means that they could move, if they chose, from their relatively tenuous tech jobs to federal government jobs or contractors in the government, which meant gave them more security and stability. And so you see home ownership increasing a lot among the South Asian community. So now you get a community that's putting down roots, particularly in the Fairfax County of Northern Virginia and the Montgomery County in Maryland. As the South Asian population in the DMV area became permanent, you get members of the second generation. That has correspondingly risen. And the second generation, which was not limited as much as the first generation, the specific careers of choice, is now increasingly looking to DC in terms of employment in state and federal governments, as well as seeking to be political participants in the political dialogue. Now, the bulk of the South Asians in the DMV area still contribute primarily to the science and tech sector of that economy. So here you go, that's the Northern Virginia sort of corridor. As I just sort of wrap up for the current situation that we have, a reflection of the permanence and vigor of the South Asian American community in the DMV is reflected in the establishments that were created. And if you look at the historical sort of outline that I gave you in the previous slide, you'll see that the first temple that was established in the Shiva Vishnu temple, which is in Lanham, Maryland, was established in 1988, exactly around the time that the tech sort of influx came in. Similarly, Patel Brothers in Langley Park was opened up as a grocery store to serve the needs of the South Asians in the area. The Langley Park area in Maryland also opened up a number of other Indian stores like Salmon Raj for electronic goods, India Sari Palace, a number of restaurants, and so on. Proliferation of this has continued taking place. So now we have not only just these major focal areas, but numbers of smaller temples, places of worship, grocery stores have sprung up all over Maryland and DC and in Virginia. Cultural associations promoting festivals, arts, traditional dances, and performances have increasingly kept up with mainstream movie theaters that are now showing Bollywood movies. And second generation South Asians have embraced their own place in this immigrant fabric by creating their own groups of networking and social groups. So you have the single South Asians in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, the South Asian Bar Association of DC, NetSap DC. So you see the increasing presence of second generation people here too. Finally, it doesn't mean that the community is without its own issues. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this because I know that Lakshmi and Darakshan are the experts on this, but I just do want to mention some of the major issues that the community continues to face. One is racism, which has increased after post 9/11, the backlash, the rising Islamophobia, and as the economy goes up and down, there is an inevitable backlash that happens. But the creation of a larger and more visible community also means that there are higher numbers of counted incidents of racism. Within the South Asian community, there's a huge problem in terms of the gender issues that take place within the community. There is a huge gap between education, job opportunity, wages, and domestic labor between men and women in the South Asian community. And women tend to be primarily burdened with multiple of these tasks. The third thing is sexuality. The LGBTQ acceptance in the South Asian communities continues to lag behind a lot of other communities, even as the numbers of open South Asian LGBTQs continues to grow. And last of all, representation. South Asian representation in the public life of the nation lags far behind its contribution to America. Now, this is a complex issue, but this is the growing popularity of activist organizations which are trying to get South Asian Americans enthusiastic and participating in the political future is a very heartening and important marker of the community. So that's where I'm going to stop. That's all my talk for today. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to answering any questions you may have.
Great, thank you, Jyothi. That was remarkable that you covered that much of the history. So thank you for that. Next, we have Lakshmi Sridaran. She's the executive director of South Asian Americans Leading Together, SALT, a national South Asian racial justice policy and advocacy organization. From 2014 to 2019, she was SALT's Director of National Policy and Advocacy, where she developed SALT's policy and legislative agenda, which focuses on immigration, racial profiling, and combating hate violence. I hand it over to you, Lakshmi.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks, Jyoti, for the historical grounding. It's really great to be with everyone today. I know it's a very tense week and a lot on everyone's minds, but hoping to kind of pick up where Jyoti left off in terms of the issues that as a South Asian American community that we're facing and that are actually very critical for elected officials to be addressing. And just to give you a quick kind of background of SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, many folks think of us as an organization that was formed in the aftermath of 9/11. And while our mission was really catalyzed after that, the organization actually was started just prior to the events of 9/11. And really, we were created originally as an organization to fill the gaps in really political and electoral representation and to encourage leadership development in the community. But I think one of the really important lessons from 9/11 was that actually systems change and policy change are really critical to bringing about the conditions that will really benefit our community. And so that was a real shift in the organization. And I think one of the most important things that happened then too, shortly after, was the establishment of the National Coalition of South Asian Organizations. And so today that is about 60 local South Asian organizations around the country that really help inform some of the priorities of SALT and keep us grounded in what's happening in the community. And so I would say like the issues that we're really focused on at SALT, of course, is the backlash and hate violence that Jyoti touched on that really disproportionately impacts Muslim and Sikh communities within the South Asian population broadly that we saw after 9/11 and that continues today. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what we're seeing today. Issues around, of course, immigration and kind of the strata of the population all the way from undocumented to possessing green cards. And then, of course, the civil rights issues that really impact many of the populations within the South Asian community. And again, a lot of which were a sort of catalyzed awareness around that following 9/11 and sort of the way the state reacted to our populations. And I would say for us, I think while we are a pan-South Asian organization, I think one of the most important lessons that we've learned over time as an institution is that there is power in having a shared identity as South Asian, but it's also really important that we don't mask the disparities within our community that very much define the experience of being South Asian in the US. And a lot of that is what we have found is based on religion and caste and class and country of origin, English proficiency, immigration status. And I think those are the things that we're, as an institution, really learning. How do we balance the power that comes with a shared identity, but also the real importance in prioritizing the populations that are disproportionately impacted because of these characteristics. And so just to kind of start off with the first issue around hate violence, one of the things that we've been doing since 9/11, but really more proficiently in the last 5 years, kind of in the lead up to the first Trump presidential election, is tracking incidents of hate violence that occur in our communities. And so, there is a distinction between hate crimes and hate violence. We often think of hate crimes, but those have to meet a pretty high legal threshold to actually be considered and categorized as a hate crime. That has to do with, the motivation behind the crime and how the law sees it. So we talk about incidents of hate violence as anything that includes a physical assault, damage to property, and, verbal threats to people. And then we also monitor xenophobic political rhetoric that's coming from both media and elected officials. that is targeting South Asian, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Arab, and Middle Eastern American communities is sort of how we define that broadly. And I think what we've really found over the years, over these last 5 years, where we've tracked about 1,000 incidents of this kind of violence and rhetoric, is that those who are Muslim or who are racialized or perceived as Muslim face the vast majority of this and the deadliest of this violence. And consistently every year have found that it's always over 90%. And in recent years, when we've been able to do more nuanced research, that it's often those with darker skin, even within that population, those of course who wear hijab, and women as well, so are disproportionately targeted. And I think, one of the things we've been thinking about for a while, and of course with the murder of George Floyd, that I think, again, another catalyst moment that really raised awareness around an issue that of course has been around since the founding of this nation, the patent violence and murdering of Black populations in this country by police, the state, et cetera, is that it really, for us to think about the way we address hate violence, we've traditionally thought about it involves raising more awareness with police or building more relationships with police to be able to address these hate crimes. But I think increasingly we are really being forced to think about, is that really the route that we want to take as a community? Or what are the other options that are there? And how can we also think about this violence not as interpersonal, but as deeply influenced by the government, right? If you have a Muslim ban in place, if you have so much repression from the government that's targeting these communities, we can't be surprised that there's interpersonal violence on the ground, and to really see the source of it, and that maybe perhaps the police is another arm of the same source of violence, right, that's being encouraged by the government upon our communities, and is that really the best place to go? So asking these complicated questions, and or in the absence of an alternative, what do we do? And so those are the kind of questions that we're asking in our communities right now, and that other organizations have been doing actually for much longer than we have. And so, really, I think it boils down to the question of what kinds of systems of racism are we also reinforcing as South Asians, even as we are at times the victims of white supremacy and racism. So shifting gears a little bit to immigration, I think we often think about, when we think about South Asian immigration, we often think of the single kind of linear immigration pathway that's voluntary, that's about, achieving a particular type of economic status by coming here. And it's usually done through an H-1B visa or the companion H-4 visa or a green card for some people. And often sort of in the IT and medical sectors. But I think, as an organization, we feel like these particular populations within the South Asian community are often, very well represented. And so we really focus on the South Asian immigrant populations who have, a more vulnerable or temporal immigration status, like DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, temporary protected status, those who are refugees and those seeking asylum. And a lot of times, even among our own community, there's not awareness that these populations exist among us, and that they don't necessarily have the kind of political representation and lobbying power that other South Asian populations with other immigrant statuses do. And so increasingly at SALT, we've been working with those, like turning our attention really to those who are seeking asylum, and have seen an influx in the number of asylum seekers from India, in particular from Nepal, Bangladesh, and other countries in the subcontinent. And many of them are fleeing, state violence in their home country. And we've also seen this in correlation with the increase in Hindu nationalism as well in India, which, I think was really precipitated by the election of Modi in 2014. So that these are, we're starting to make these more transnational connections about what's happening abroad and how that's impacting the South Asian American experience here. So you have people who are fleeing that violence, and then you have, once they are able to arrive in the US, those who are fortunate enough to be able to not die in their very perilous journey, are coming to detention facilities and languishing there for years, sometimes with no language access or support that they are entitled to, no medical attention. And in fact, I think folks have probably seen recent reports of, unfortunately, South Asian doctors who are in these facilities who are performing non-consensual procedures on women and sterilizing them, and really participating in the repressive ICE immigration sort of infrastructure. And often there's no movement on their cases because there really is a willful lack by judges to really understand the country conditions. And often the US supports the governments and the regimes that these populations are fleeing. And so there really isn't an interest in acknowledging that they're fleeing a repressive government. So this is really the trend that we've been seeing in the last 5 years. And then, of course, this is all in the midst of increased and heightened immigration enforcement of all of our communities here in the US, communities of color. And I think folks are aware, of course, of all the threats that have been coming from this administration on top of the COVID-19 pandemic. But, just last summer in the DMV area, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, targeted and raided at least one South Asian restaurant that we know of in DC. And so we partnered with Justice for Muslims Collective, led by Darakshan, who you'll hear from soon. And JMC really, developed these really comprehensive in-language resources and trainings for South Asians in the area to canvass and support South Asian business owners. And then we jointly developed a South Asian Rapid Response Network, which has basically turned into an online listserv of more than 600 people, mainly who are South Asian, who are in the DMV area, and willing and able to provide language and legal support for detained South Asian migrants. So not only has that network, been supportive of those who were impacted here in the region, but have also gone on to support a lot of the language needs of the people who are detained in those southern border facilities that I mentioned. So that's some of the work, around immigration. Kind of the last thing I'll say about that is, as I was mentioning, the threats that are coming from the government now are, a lot of them were focused, as we saw, one of Trump's first moves was to eliminate the DACA program in his first year in office. And we saw that in 2017. And of course, repeated attacks on asylum and refugee admittance numbers and all of that we've been seeing over the years. But, he always sort of pretended that H-1B visa holders, green card holders, and others who he viewed as more meritorious immigrants who are deserving of being in this country were the ones that he favored, and many of them within the South Asian community as well supported that and supported him in his immigration policies because of that. But then recently we've been seeing the attacks even on those communities and the slashing or the threatening of slashing the H-1B program, the number of green cards, the threat of eliminating work authorization for H-4 visa holders who are often the spouses of H-1B visa holders and who are disproportionately South Asian women, actually over 90% of H-4 visa holders in this country. So, so what we see here is a real opportunity to do some political education that immigrants across the spectrum are being, impacted by the threats of this administration and our immigration system. But unfortunately, instead, what we're seeing sometimes from mainly the Indian American community is that there's still an interest in sort of preserving immigration benefits only for particular populations. And again, around those who, would gain green cards. And so there's very divisive legislation right now in the Senate that almost passed that would lift the caps on green cards that would really disproportionately and overwhelmingly benefit Indian Americans, but it would really come at the expense of other people from other countries who now have, at least small quotas for how many people from their country can be admitted through green cards. And that would virtually be gone if these caps were lifted. So we see this as an opportunity in a population that we should be working with to think about strategies that are not divisive and that actually support and help all communities instead of harming some to benefit others. So that's kind of our strategy around immigration. And then just really quickly on civil rights and civil liberties in general. And you know, Darakshan can speak a lot more to this and the work that they've really been doing around the infrastructure that was created by our government after 9/11 to surveil our communities. And we've seen just an uptick in that, of course, under this administration, but quite frankly, under both parties, and that really disproportionately impact, again, Muslim communities. And many of these programs were actually created to target and surveil and to really dismantle the organizing and movements of Black liberation, and have been recycled and sort of perfected in some ways to now target, again, of course, still the Black community, but also Muslim communities and others. So, you know, here we are like a few days after the election. And I think, again, another lesson for us is that both political parties, quite frankly, are responsible for these conditions that we're facing. And so really, you know, no matter what the outcome is, that this kind of systems change is really critical and needs to happen. And that work, you know, has to continue. And the very last thing I'll share is just, you know, we just actually launched about a month ago a report on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the South Asian American community. And again, with a careful eye on sort of illuminating the disparate impact on different South Asian populations. And I think the thing about crises that we all, I think, really understand so clearly now is that they often illuminate and magnify the entrenched inequities in our systems. And so that's exactly what we found in our report. And we did a combination of a community survey, interviews with our national coalition partners that I mentioned earlier, video testimonials from directly impacted people, and a lot of secondary research. And I'll quickly just share some of the findings that we have, and which was that South Asian Americans who were already vulnerable have been the most directly impacted by the pandemic. And a lot of that, like I said before, around immigration status, experiences with domestic violence, which Jyothi talked about, underlying health conditions, unsafe working environments, and so many things. The data on COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are currently incomplete. And I think this part around data collection and data disaggregation is something that we've been working on at SALT for a long time, is to really get better data on our communities. And in this case, many were often labeled as other or other Asian or unknown. And so a lot of that data is being masked. South Asians, of course, are at high risk if they contract COVID-19 because of other underlying conditions like heart disease and diabetes, multi-generational housing, and then the lack of language accessible public health resources. So that's something we heard a lot from groups, is that they spent so much time having to translate resources when really the government should have been doing that. Every domestic violence survivor support organization we interviewed explicitly named the drastic increase in gender-based violence during this time. And then, of course, with all the immigration threats, 85% of the people who responded to our survey said that they're worried about their immigration status. And Jyothi mentioned public charge, and because of that particular, another threat to our immigration system is if you are perceived or labeled as a public charge, being deportable or losing benefits. And so people were very afraid to even enroll in the benefits that they're entitled to because of that. And all this to say that South Asian community organizations are the ones who are really filling the gaps for all of this. And I think Darakshan can speak really great to that on all the amazing work they're doing. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi, for your great presentation. And I forgot to mention that Lakshmi also teaches for our program. She teaches the South Asian American Intersectionalities and Solidarities class, and we're hoping to have her teach that the next academic year. And finally, we have Darakshan Raja. She's a community builder and organizer who is committed to building institutional power of Muslim communities in the region, with a particular focus on the leadership of Muslim women. Darakshan currently serves as a co-director and I believe co-founding director of the Justice for Muslims Collective, and leads JMC's strategic visioning, power building and leadership development efforts in the greater Washington region. She also leads JMC's organizational development and advocacy on issues around gendered Islamophobia, immigration, surveillance, and the Muslim ban. She currently serves on the DC government's Street Harassment Advisory Committee as a religious tolerance appointee to implement the Street Harassment Prevention Act in DC. Join me in welcoming Darakshan Raja.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me. That was so much powerful information. Thank you to Jyoti and also to Lakshmi for that incredible overview of South Asian communities, South Asian history, and also I know I have the honor of working very closely with Lakshmi at SALT for so many of the things that we do. I will cover a little bit about the efforts that we have been doing in the local area, in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. When it comes to our organization's work, obviously we are a MEMSA focus. So what I mean by that is we're Muslim, Arab, South Asia, Middle Eastern, North African, and South Asian communities. And this is sort of a term that came up really post 9/11 to talk about some of the similar experiences that different groups were going through post 9/11, really hate violence. Obviously, that is not to say that all of our communities are homogenous. They're not. I mean, even South Asian, we could really, really look into what that means, because on the ground, I can tell you, not everyone necessarily will say that they identify as South Asian. They might identify more to their religious identity or their ethnic or national identity more. For example, you know, Pakistani American, Bangladeshi American, not necessarily a South Asian pan identity. I think there's still a lot more work to be done on what that means or what a Desi identity means, and not replicate some of the power dynamics that exist within our communities. So often when we talk about South Asian communities, it's really the narrative is focused on Indian Americans and not necessarily the rest of South Asian communities who also have, you know, divergent sort of experiences in the country. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. I also really want to start out, you know, Jyoti did such an incredible job sort of laying out the historical perspective on South Asians and our presence in this country. One thing I just want to add is the part around our history and connection of immigration and labor and our American presence and our citizenship necessarily. So we obviously know South Asians have been here in this country for a very, very long time. But I know for me, as somebody who migrated to this country from Pakistan, you know, there's not necessarily a political education and understanding of what does a South Asian American identity look like, or what our historical context is. Often the visible presence that we see, or the one that most people really want to support, is the presence of doctors, engineers, lawyers. I say very much that respectability class of our communities, and not necessarily reminding and remembering that really some of the first South Asians in this country who were here as, you know, colonialism was impacting our communities and people were fighting the colonial rule, were actually laborers and workers, and were organizers, and were part of movements with other communities who were fighting white supremacy, who were fighting immigration enforcement. And so, you know, this necessarily, I think there is this whitewashing of our own history in this country that often happens, that I think is really, really important to remind ourselves that, again, some of the first folks here, of course, we know that immigration is also very gendered, were men, and men who were workers. And so I think often, again, the kind of story that we are told about immigration in our communities is very much that respectability one that's post 65. I also think it's important to note that part of the reason why we don't have necessarily communities that were really well settled in this country is because this country, through immigration, wanted us banned. So in 1917, when all these white folks who were nativists got really concerned about all this immigration that was happening from Asian communities, Asian American community, Asian communities, also including the subcontinent of South Asia, or at that point, India, they decided to pass laws to ban our communities. So in 1917, when you get the Asiatic Barred Zones Act, what does that do? That says that by law, there's no immigration that can come from any part of the Middle East, any part of Asia, any part of South Asia or India at that time. And then we know that we have in 1923, the Supreme Court of the United States in United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind says that if you are someone of Hindu origin or Indian origin, that you cannot be naturalized as a citizen within this country. So again, I think that if we look at the history of South Asian immigration, often at many multiple points, there has been a concerted effort by the state to say that we do not belong here. We're not American. We're always going to be the other. We're actually, if you look at the reading within that case of, United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind, like these racist white supremacist judges literally say, again, I think it's also important to think about how sometimes our communities will try to assume or say that we are, adjacent to white communities or we are white, which is what Bhagat Singh Thind tried to do by arguing that he had Aryan ancestry, and hence he could argue that he might be white. But the justices at that time responded back to him in a really racist way and said, yeah, you're not Black, but you can never also be white. And so I think that some of those kind of historical moments of how racial construction of South Asians in this country has occurred is really important to take into account, because I think we see the ways in which how our political orientation has grown or developed or not developed, and also what we're willing to say, what we're willing to sideline with and what we're not willing to do. And also that, again, we were not wanted in this country for a very long time, and people were deported. There are many stories of, organizers and movement folks who were trying to also support anti-colonial struggles from right here, and the United States government collaborated with the British Empire to surveil them, to deport them, to detain them, to arrest them. So I think it's really important to remember some of those historical contexts as we talk about the moment that we're in right now in 2020, when we're seeing again, we're in the middle of literally trying to get what the elections are looking like, the election results. But really, as we're seeing this sort of backlash from particularly white communities who want to maintain control, who want this country to only be for white communities. And you're seeing some of the policies that they crystallize is around immigration. And so again, I think looking to the historical context of what our people did in the past 60, 70, 80 years ago, how they were disappeared, how they were banned from this country, and then who was then allowed back in? Because once we get the 65 Immigration Act that opens immigration back up to South Asian communities, who was actually allowed into this country legally versus not? And we know that has deep implications and deep connections to labor, which is why you see a certain kind of a professional class that is only allowed to come here through legal routes. That doesn't mean that the working class South Asians don't exist. Absolutely, we do. We're here. We see it all over the country, but often working class South Asians do get erased. And I think that's important to underscore, because as we're in a moment right now where we have COVID, and as Lakshmi pointed, COVID only exacerbated the issues and systemic differences, systemic violence that we already had. The virus in itself, the pandemic in itself, is not the reason why we're seeing all this disparity. What it actually has exposed is it's exposed the fact that we have a capitalistic system. We don't have good healthcare. We don't have accessible healthcare. We don't have systems that are actually built around caring for our communities. And those who are hit the hardest, who are suffering, who are struggling, are again communities who are working class with no access. And so really, when we talk about in terms of, and I'll talk a little bit about the work we do around COVID, because I think that is important and on everybody's mind. With that, I'm gonna pause a little bit and share just in terms of some data around how many, what the numbers look like. The DMV does have a pretty big population and concentration of South Asian communities. Obviously, within South Asian communities, if you break it down, Indian Americans do tend to be the biggest majority in terms of South Asians, but still we do have a good significant number of Pakistani Americans, Afghan Americans, Bhutanese and Nepali communities. We've also seen now a growth and increase in Bangladeshi communities who are here. We have somewhat a small also group presence of Sri Lankans within the area. So even when we talk about South Asian communities, I think it's really important to break down who are we talking about, because not all communities are resourced as well. And also, again, the numbers of Indian Americans are much higher than any other group. And I think it plays out when it comes to, for example, some of the political leanings, or who's being, or how foreign policy, or what is the politics happening right back in the subcontinent or back home, plays out then in terms of some of the conflict or some of the challenges that we are facing within also the diaspora, as it is not actually a unified diaspora politically. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is the case. So I'm going to share my screen with you all because we actually just did a pretty big civic engagement campaign this year as a grassroots organization. And we did it because, often being a small grassroots organization, you end up sometimes only speaking to a certain echo chamber of other activists or organizers or people who've been politicized. But we wanted to go beyond that and really get to our communities. Who's here? What are the neighborhoods looking like? What is also some of the shifts in the neighborhoods, which I'll talk at literally the end of this, because I think we also have to kind of look at what is happening in the next 5 to 10 years as our communities are facing displacement. But what we were really sort of trying to do was, again, trying to figure out where are the neighborhood concentrations? Where do people go to eat? Where do people go for like their groceries? Because again, that presence of that community businesses actually is also indicator of the community's presence and the community's settlement within that area. So we used our the first few months of our civic engagement campaign really focused on the census, get out the count. This year is an important census year. Of course, we wrapped it up. But we know that in the census, the census is important for not only key resources, but also political representation. Really, really critical to note that Virginia's now shift to this blue state, or where you're getting, even at the state legislature, the fact that Democrats for the first time became the majority, South Asians have been a critical part of that shift. 10 years ago, it didn't exist in the same way. And so, always keeping an eye to what are some ways that our community could be totally disenfranchised. And so we were worried that the census could be one way, and undercount could really harm our communities. You don't get the count proper, guess what? We don't get the resources, but also we don't get the political seats that are determined through the census. So a couple of things, we did earlier on this year, right after the census, we did a pretty robust Get Out the Vote campaign, again, focused on Virginia. We wanted to focus on Virginia because that's where a lot of long-term communities are. Of course, Maryland also has a huge community, so does DC, but really for us, Virginia was our priority. We, through our process, were able to do overall, as of last Friday, we did about 90,000 calls to get out the vote for Muslim, Arab, South Asian community members. And in the beginning, we did a small questionnaire survey for particularly our first wave of calls, which was low propensity voters, working class community members. And the questions we asked them were, what are the most important issues to you that you want the president to really focus on, the next president? Not surprising, some of the top ones that came up was Islamophobia and racism was a huge concern of the community. Responding to COVID-19 was another huge issue that the community really wanted to address. The expansion of affordable healthcare was another big issue that everybody wanted. On issues of public safety, the top two that everybody wanted to address was hate crimes against communities of color, including our own communities. And the second was police accountability and police reform. And I think that's really important to know, because sometimes people really try to pit our communities and say that, that we only care about hate violence, but not necessarily what is happening by state violence or police brutality. So that was a second issue that everybody really cared about. The third issue that people actually noted was government surveillance of their community mosques and community centers. centers. So state surveillance was also a pretty big thing that people were actually worried about. In terms of some other questions that we just asked was like for low propensity voters, like were they motivated to go out to the polls or not? You know, even folks who never really felt motivated, like a big percentage of them said, about 86% said that they felt more motivated and were going to go out and vote. And I think that's so important to underscore, because wherever we're seeing the fight in swing states, whether it's Michigan, data out of Michigan is telling us that it's actually the Arab American vote and the Black vote that really helped sort of tip the election towards Biden. In Wisconsin, it was also about 20,000 votes. We're seeing the same in parts like North Carolina, Georgia, where the count is still coming in, and in Arizona. But really, like here I say, we have to give credit to our organizers who really went out and tried and did mobilize POC votes. And I would say the South Asian vote is part of that in terms of what is shifting. And I know I'm talking about Muslim, South Asian, and Arab. Sort of, I don't mean to interchange them, because obviously they are different communities. With the exception of when you're Muslim, you can also, there's a big, pretty significant South Asian Muslim community. But I just say this to say that I think we're in a really critical moment of building POC power. And I do believe that South Asian communities are an integral part of that. And also there is a new generation of South Asian organizers I do believe is trying to be on the right side in terms of political alignment and understands that we shouldn't be throwing anyone under the bus. That isn't to say we don't have folks who are right-wingers or who are Trump supporters, absolutely. But I think we should also keep a positive perspective out on our communities of where the majority is and also where some of the shifts are happening. So that's a little bit about our civic engagement work. The second piece I'll mention is around our COVID work that we're doing. We all know we're in the middle of a pandemic. Also, Jessica or anyone, please let me know if I'm going over time and how much more time I have, because once I get started, I'm sorry, I will keep on going. Awesome, 5 minutes left. That's cool. I will make sure to cover my points in 5 minutes. In terms of the pandemic and what is happening around the pandemic. So as you all know, this administration, the Trump administration, has done an absolutely atrocious job in being there for any communities. Even with the CARES Act, even with the stimulus checks going out. Many members of our communities who are undocumented, who are contractors, who don't really have a so-called work history that is trackable, did not receive any kind of support. So around May, JMC put together a COVID-19 relief fund for about $176,000 to support South Asian, Muslim, Arab, Middle Eastern communities in the DMV area who had been excluded and were facing evictions, were facing any kind of sort of just the impact, the economic and personal impact of it. We got about 350 applications out of it. I will say the bulk of who applied were South Asians. There is a pretty big, sizable working class South Asian community in Northern Virginia who are also right now at the forefront of some of the most powerful cancel rent campaigns that are happening. Like, it's really powerful to see our aunties like show up out there and be like to landlords, like, you can't remove us, you can't do any of that. But they're also struggling very heavily. So as a result of this, we were able to make support out to 176 families. Again, the bulk of them, I would say probably 40% or so, were actually South Asian community members. So when we talk about issues of cancel rent, of actually housing, of unemployment, of who is being impacted, again, we had the majority of our fund was dispersed to individuals who are your Uber, your Lyft drivers, your restaurant workers. Tied to also that is, as part of our SARI initiative that Lakshmi had mentioned earlier, we started out as an immigration sort of crew in terms of really fighting immigration enforcement, targeting South Asian communities. I will share our website with you all, which has in-language material as well as the work that we did. But during COVID, one of the projects we took on was we basically mapped out the 300 restaurants, South Asian restaurants that are in the DMV area. We called them up and we basically helped supported them with any kind of basic business loans, just making sure to check in on them. Because as we've seen out as a consequence of this COVID-19, many of those community businesses, mom and pop shops who are like critical to building community have been economically hit so bad that many of them have unfortunately had to close down, but also have had to let workers go, which if we understand anything about, you know, immigrant communities and working class migrants who come to this country, often they are being employed by those community businesses or community restaurants. That's their actual source of income. So that has been one of our other projects. I would say as we are looking towards the future, one of our sort of worries and concerns is how is COVID going to impact some of that community infrastructure in terms of the community businesses and restaurants who are going under. We don't have the final data, but I do know as we were making calls, like a good significant number of them are under operating, have had to really let go of folks. And what is the implication of that towards our community when we know that those businesses might be then taken over by bigger corporations? We know Amazon headquarters is coming into this area, moving into Northern Virginia. That is also where we have a sizable South Asian working class community. So one of the things as JMC that we're really thinking about is in the next 5 to 10 years, where are these communities going to be displaced to? And so we really do think they're going to be moving further into the burbs, which burbs don't really have, you know, like Richmond, Central VA. A lot of those areas don't really have that much infrastructure around organizing. And so really thinking about as we move plan, one is to defend our people who are already here. How do we protect them? Advocacy, organizing, solidarity, coalition building. But I also think we have to be thinking and planning for the next 5 to 10 years. What are some projections we can make and where will our communities be displaced and moved to? And then again, with COVID, I mean, the impact on working class community members just right here across the board has been devastating. I mean, the displacement, the eviction, the lack of housing. You know, if you don't have housing, it's very hard to have stability. So, you know, I would say that I know UMD is out here. I know many of y'all are students. I'd really, really encourage y'all to join, you know, our groups, our community mutual aid efforts. We will need every single person to really address what is happening, irrespective of whoever we get in the White House, whether it's Biden or whether it's Trump. Hopefully it's Biden. But regardless, we are in the middle of a pandemic in a very difficult moment. And so really, I would say if at the end I could finish it off is that we are gonna need each other. Get engaged, get plugged. Let me know if y'all need resources, and I will also put some resources within the chat for you all to have. But other than that, I'm grateful to you all for having me here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Every time I encounter you guys, I learn so much. So I thank each of our panelists. Now I want to invite our 2 student moderators who will be kind of moderating the Q&A session. And as a reminder to the attendees, I just want to encourage you to ask questions. You can say that it's for a particular panelist or for all the panelists, just to get that started. Also, I believe that Jessica and I think Darakshan also has put some links to, Jessica put the link for the SALT report, and I think Darakshan put a link for issue brief, right, that she talked about. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Ishan and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Park. Hi, everybody. My name is Ishan Kapoor. Before I start, I just want to give a brief thank you to all 3 of our panelists for their discussions today. A little bit about myself. I'm a sophomore accounting major. I'm really interested in getting the word out about South Asian American resources and information to the general population. So now I'll hand it off to my co-moderator, Sarah, who'll get us started into the questions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I am a neuroscience major, and I'm also a sophomore. And as Ishan said, I'm just really interested in getting out the word. So I'll start off with the first question. So Jyothi, this is directed to you if you wanted to start off with this question. So in terms of Lascar sailors and early East Indian indentured servants, what was their caste and religious makeup? And were those categories different at the time?
So indentured servants tended to come from working class rural areas. They were mostly farming communities that were driven off their land because of the high rents charged by the British colonials. And so they signed these contracts in the hope that they would one day be able to come back. Lascars tended to be a motley crew. And over a period of time, so they could actually, Lascars could be created from a bunch of different castes, and they almost had their own little social structure within themselves. So they were Muslims, they were Hindus, they had their own little sort of language and things like that. They had this cross-cultural influence with Chinese words and Thai words and Indian words, and it was their own little language that only the Lascars kind of could understand, and it was basically pan-Indian Ocean. So it spanned from China to Aden, you know, the east coast of Africa. So again, I think it was a very different sort of setup in terms of the Lascars as opposed to the indentured servants. Now the indentured servants, there were very few that came early on in to America because you know, the British Empire loses America as a colony fairly soon after that. So they only send their indentured workers then to places like British Guyana, Suriname. So the British Caribbean has a huge population of Indian indentured labor. And they don't really come that much to the Americas anymore.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that answer. Our next question is directed to all three of our panelists. So if Lakshmi, you want to start us off, and then Darakshan, and then Jyoti, you can finish the question. The question is, are there any resources or mentors that South Asian youth can be pointed towards that are accessible in the DMV? Specifically, are there any resources you recommend to combat anti-Blackness?
Yeah, great question. We at SALT are, you know, I mentioned some of our political education efforts, and those are mostly just getting underway. And we do have a training and resource guide on our website. And we've just brought on a trainer who has expertise, you know, working around anti-Black racism in particular in the South Asian American community. So definitely encourage folks to visit our website to see, and really it's a collection of resources from other experts and organizations that have invested in this work. One that I'll just point out that I think has been really useful for us has been the Queer South Asian National Network, QSAN's guide to having confronting anti-Black racism within, you know, our own families and friends, and communities, which often are the hardest conversations, I think, and the feedback that we've gotten over the years. And so, you know, a really good kind of facilitation guide on how to have that conversation. And I think one thing I'll say related to what Darakshan mentioned earlier is like, there are so many woke like aunties and uncles. And so this isn't to be seen necessarily as a generational divide in terms of where people are in their political education process. And so to, you know, to really encourage folks to be open for intergenerational conversations. There were some, I think, really powerful conversations that were sparked when the uncle Suresh Bhai Patel in Alabama was, you know, mistaken for someone who racialized as Black, essentially. And then it was quickly found out that he didn't have English proficiency and should have been provided that support and wasn't, and then was beaten to the point of partial paralysis. And so I think, again, that was another catalyst moment, unfortunately, in our community that helped actually facilitate a lot of intergenerational dialogue around how the ways in which we are impacted by the racist structure in this country. So again, and that was well documented actually in the Aerogram. There was a great series of young people talking to their parents about that incident. So again, another example of an intergenerational conversation. So those are just a few that I'll highlight.
Awesome. I think following up on Lakshmi's recommendation, I did put in the website for SARI here, which is DMV rights, SARI DMV rights. And, you know, obviously the bulk of the work we were doing was around immigration, but now the business outreach work that we've done has actually also turned into having conversations with business owners around not calling the police, because we know that what happened with George Floyd, it was an Arab American owned grocery store that called the police that resulted in the murder of George Floyd. So how do we have conversations with our business owners and, you know, who are often calling the police, which then facilitates violence towards Black communities, but also marginalized communities within our own. And so we've been building a lot of internal material on scripts and so forth. We're testing it out. if they work really well, we will put them on the website. But if you're interested in joining that work and canvassing and going out, definitely reach out to Sari. We're always looking for more folks who want to do that. And right now we've been working in Northern Virginia, DC, and Baltimore. We would love to also do more work within PG County, sort of Maryland counties a little bit more. So if you're interested, I think, join this crew. I'll say for me, the best political education and the best political growth I've ever done is with other people. You just grow so much more. Resources are really awesome, but I think building and having a community of other South Asian peers who are also committed has been probably the best thing, and helps you go further. So definitely want to put a plug if that's what you're looking for, to come out and join Sari.
Oh, I don't have much to offer in terms of resources, but all I can say is that I've been seeing a lot of young people really, really wanting to have these conversations with their families and with their parents especially, and I'm just so proud of that. And that's just what you should be doing, you know, just read up and don't be scared to ask the hard questions, you know, I mean, ask the questions and look at the data. Look at the data. I mean, the history of the country tells us that every single time we have tried to, you know, be quiet, go with the flow, it hasn't worked for us. Look at Bhagat Singh Thind, as Darakshan pointed out. You know, when we try to follow the rules and be the good people, it has never worked out for us. In fact, the biggest gains that we made as a community came in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. You know, so the evidence is there for anyone to read it. So the better you are, the more you try to fly under the radar, it hasn't worked for us. And so that's something that, you know, you can always, if you look at that and you just look at that, you can take it to your families, and, you know, you can talk to them about it. And there's a lot of colorism in our communities. You know, so those are things that I think you guys as a generation, especially when you're first generation South Asian, speaking like me, for example, you're almost so inured to it. At least when we were growing up, it was such a constant presence that it never occurred to us what a negative thing it was. But I think now, even in South Asia, there is a movement towards recognizing the danger of being so colorist. And so I think just as the world is changing and becoming, I think, a kinder place, it behooves us to kind of remind our elders also that maybe they need to relearn some of the things that, you know, they learned when they were younger.
Thank you for those answers. So one last question, and this is directed to all of you. So a lot of us as South Asians living in the United States have a really complicated relationship with our culture and our heritage, and how we kind of embrace that. So my question to you is, if you could go back and give your younger selves one piece of advice pertaining to your relationship with your heritage, what would it be and why?
That's a really powerful question, and a really beautiful question. I think if I could go back to my younger self, I think actually really reading up on the history of South Asians in the country, particularly Pakistani working class. You know, I grew up in the Bronx, and there wasn't really a reference point of my people's history here. I didn't know. And so when you don't know, you sometimes don't know who you are. Or you don't know what you're building upon. You feel lost. You try to cling on to, you're like, oh, I'm not Black, I'm not Latinx, I'm also not white. What am I? What is my identity here? And what does that mean? And I think it wasn't until much later, after grad school, after college, because even that education doesn't always do justice to our histories, that I took it upon myself to read and find stories of women on top of that. What did they do? Who were they? What is the work? How I know I benefited from it, but how did I benefit from it? And what is sort of my role, my call in my work as I keep moving forward, so that a younger Darakshan down the line knows, oh, there were organizers, there were people who looked like me who were fighting, you know, who were not trying to assimilate into whiteness, who weren't saying, whiteness is the best thing ever, but we're critical of it. I want our folks to know our stories, like our people's stories. So that's what I would say is, I think that's one advice I would give myself much younger on.
Yeah, I guess I'll follow up and say, you know, I grew up in probably an almost an opposite environment than Darakshan, in this like small exurb outside of Atlanta in Georgia. And so it was, as you can imagine, really white and conservative. And there actually weren't really, you know, any South Asians or even many other people of color. And so I think for me, so much of what fueled me was a lot of anger and frustration. And sometimes even now as an adult, it's hard to not feel fueled by sort of, you know, more anger and frustration. And so I think if I, you know, I think what I've learned over time is that really transformational and revolutionary change actually comes from a place of love. And to be able to move from that now has taken so much time and still is a learning process. And I wish that, you know, I could have told myself to be a little bit more forgiving, mostly to myself, and yeah, and to move from that place instead of always a place of anger. But I do think there's a place for that as well, to catalyze change. But I think overall, that's kind of what I would tell myself. It's a great question. Thank you.
So I think I'm approaching this question from the other side. In a sense, I am a first generation immigrant. So I really never had this questioning about what is my place? How confused am I? Am I too Indian? Am I too American? It always just came naturally to me. Now, as a mother, I have seen my children, and my children have gone in different directions. I have one who is extremely involved and interested in everything that is, you know, related to the community. There's another one who is not interested at all. And I kind of sort of just made it my place to be there. If and when they're interested, I'm always available to give them information, but I really do try. I think it's part of being an academic and overthinking things. I never try to tell my children whether they're Indian enough or American enough, or, you know, they just are. And yes, the biggest thing I could say is that, you know, it doesn't matter what your ethnic background is, or you're constantly growing. So even if you were a straight up white American, you would be discovering yourself in middle age in ways that you never realized you could be when you're young. So yes, be kind to yourself, because you're going to keep changing, and as you grow through life, you'll find you want different things at different points of life. You know, there might be some times when you're just totally impatient about, you know, your Indian heritage or your South Asian heritage. And then there might be other points in life when you might think, oh, look, this is cool. And it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly okay to embrace it when you're ready to embrace it, or not. You know, it doesn't make you any less off as South Asian or any more of an American, or vice versa. So I would just say, be patient with yourself and just allow yourself to keep growing and learning.
Great. With that, we're going to have to wrap it up here, but I just wanted to thank again our three wonderful panelists, so powerful, and always learn so much from you, as well as I want to thank our students for really kind of initiating this conversation and for moderating the questions. I wish we had another hour where we could just kind of field questions and have a more in-depth discussion, but we'll have to end here. And perhaps this will be the impetus for us to have a follow-up conversation or a time together. So thank you all again, and to all of our co-sponsors and to our participants. I hope you have a great evening, and we'll end it here.